The Complete Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 1. Ancestry, Birth, Boyhood. My family is American and has been for generations, in all its branches, direct and collateral. Matthew Grant, the founder of the branch in America, of which I am a descendant, reached Dorchester, Massachusetts in May 1630. In 1635, he moved to what is now Windsor, Connecticut, and was the surveyor for that colony for more than 40 years. He was also, for many years of the time, town clerk. He was a married man when he arrived in Dorchester, but his children were all born in this country. His eldest son, Samuel, took lands on the east side of the Connecticut River, opposite Windsor, which have been held and occupied by descendants of his to this day. I am of the 8th generation from Matthew Grant, and 7th from Samuel. Matthew Grant's first wife died in a few years after their settlement in Windsor, and he soon after married the widow Rockwell, who, with her first husband, had been fellow passengers with him and his first wife on the ship Mary and John from Dorchester, England, in 1630. Mrs. Rockwell had several children by her first marriage and others by her second. By intermarriage, 2 or 3 generations later, I am descended from both the wives of Matthew Grant. In the 5th descending generation, my great-grandfather Noah Grant and his younger brother Solomon held commissions in the English army in 1756 in the war against the French and Indians. Both were killed that year. My grandfather, also named Noah, was then but 9 years old. At the breaking out of the War of the Revolution, after the battles of Concord and Lexington, he went with the Connecticut Company to join the Continental Army, and was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He served until the fall of Yorktown, or through the entire Revolutionary War. He must, however, have been on furlough part of the time, as I believe most of the soldiers of that period were, for he married in Connecticut during the war, had 2 children, and was a widower at the close. Soon after this he emigrated to Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, and settled near the town of Greensburg in that county. He took with him the younger of his 2 children, Peter Grant. The elder, Solomon, remained with his relatives in Connecticut until old enough to do for himself, when he emigrated to the British West Indies. Not long after his settlement in Pennsylvania, my grandfather, Captain Noah Grant, married a Miss Kelly, and in 1799 he emigrated again, this time to Ohio, and settled where the town of Deerfield now stands. He had now 5 children, including Peter, a son from his first marriage. My father, Jesse R. Grant, was the second child, oldest son by the second marriage. Peter Grant went early to Maysfield, Kentucky, where he was very prosperous, married, had a family of 9 children, and was drowned at the mouth of the Kanawha River, Virginia, in 1825, being at the time one of the wealthy men of the West. My grandmother Grant died in 1805, leaving 7 children. This broke up the family. Captain Noah Grant was not thrifty in the way of laying up stores on earth, and, after the death of his second wife, he went, with the 2 youngest children, to live with his son Peter in Maysville. The rest of the family found homes in the neighborhood of Deerfield. My father in the family of Judge Todd, the father of the late Governor Todd of Ohio. His industry and independence of character were such that I imagine his labor compensated fully for the expense of his maintenance. There must have been a cordiality in his welcome into the Todd family, for to the day of his death he looked upon Judge Todd and his wife with all the reverence he could have felt if they had been parents instead of benefactors. I have often heard him speak of Mrs. Todd as the most admirable woman he had ever known. He remained with the Todd family only a few years, until old enough to learn a trade. He went first, I believe, with his half-brother Peter Grant, who, though not a tanner himself, owned a tannery in Maysville, Kentucky. Here he learned his trade, and in a few years returned to Deerfield, and worked for, and lived in the family of Mr. Brown, the father of John Brown, whose body lies mouldering in the grave, where his soul goes marching on. I have often heard my father speak of John Brown, particularly since the events of Harper's Ferry. Brown was a boy when they lived in the same house, but he knew him afterwards, and regarded him as a man of great purity of character, of high moral and physical courage, but a fanatic and extremist in whatever he advocated. It was certainly the act of an insane man to attempt the invasion of the South and the overthrow of slavery with less than 20 men. My father set up for himself in business, establishing a tannery at Ravenna, the county seat of the Portage County. In a few years he removed from Ravenna and set up the same business at Point Pleasant, Claremont County, Ohio. During the minority of my father, the West afforded but poor facilities for the most opulent of the youth to acquire an education, and the majority were dependent, almost exclusively, upon their own exertions for whatever learning they obtained. I often heard him say that his time at school was limited to 6 months, when he was very young, too young, indeed, to learn much, or to appreciate the advantages of an education, and to a quartering school afterwards, probably while living with Judge Todd. But his thirst for education was intense. He learned rapidly, and was a constant reader up to the day of his death in his 80th year. Books were scarce in the Western Reserve during his youth, but he read every book he could borrow in the neighborhood where he lived. This scarcity gave him the early habit of studying everything he read, so that when he got through with a book, he knew everything in it. The habit continued through life. Even after reading the daily papers, which he never neglected, he could give all the important information they contained. He made himself an excellent English scholar, and before he was 20 years of age was a constant contributor to Western newspapers, and was also, from that time until he was 50 years old, an able debater in the societies for this purpose, which were common in the West at the time. He always took an active part in politics, but was never a candidate for office, except, I believe, that he was the first mayor of Georgetown. He supported Jackson for the presidency, but was a Whig, a great admirer of Henry Clay, and never voted for any other Democrat for the high office after Jackson. My mother's family lived in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, for several generations. I have little information about her ancestors. Her family took no interest in genealogy, so that my grandfather, who died when I was 16 years old, knew only back to his grandfather. On the other side, my father took great interest in the subject, and in his researches he found that there was an entailed estate in Windsor, Connecticut, belonging to the family to which his nephew, Lawson Grant, still living, was the heir. He was so much interested in the subject that he got his nephew to empower him to act in the matter, and in 1832 or 1833, when I was a boy of 10 or 11 years old, he went to Windsor, proved the title beyond dispute, and perfected the claim of the owners for a consideration, $3,000, I think. I remember the circumstance well, and remember, too, hearing him say of his return that he found some widows living on the property, who had little or nothing beyond their homes. From these he refused to receive any recompense. My mother's father, John Simpson, moved to Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, to Claremont County, Ohio, about the year 1819, taking with him his 4 children, 3 daughters and 1 son. My mother, Hannah Simpson, was the third of these children, and was then over 20 years of age. Her oldest sister was at that time married, and had several children. She still lives in Claremont County at this writing. October 5th, 1884, and is over 90 years of age. Until her memory failed her a few years ago, she thought the country ruined beyond recovery when the Democratic Party lost control in 1860. Her family, which was large, inherited her views, with the exception of 1 son who settled in Kentucky before the war. He was the only one of the children who entered the volunteer service to suppress the rebellion. Her brother, next of age, and now past 88, is also still living in Claremont County, within a few miles of the old homestead, and is as active in mind as ever. He was a supporter of the government during the war, and remains a firm believer that national success by the Democratic Party means irretrievable ruin. In June 1821, my father, Jesse R. Grant, married Hannah Simpson. I was born on the 20th of April, 1822, at Point Pleasant, Claremont County, Ohio. In the fall of 1823, we moved to Georgetown, the county seat of Brown, the adjoining county east. This place remained my home until at the age of 17, in 1839, I went to West Point. The schools, at the time of which I write, were very indifferent. There were no free schools, and none in which the scholars were classified. They were all supported by subscription, and a single teacher, who was often a man or a woman incapable of teaching much, even if they imparted all they knew, would have 30 or 40 scholars, male and female, from the infant learning the ABCs up to the young lady of 18 and the boy of 20, studying the highest branches taught. The 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. I never saw an algebra or other mathematical work higher than arithmetic in Georgetown, until after I was appointed to West Point. I then bought a work on algebra in Cincinnati, but having no teacher, it was Greek to me. My life in Georgetown was uneventful. From the age of 5 or 6 until 17, I attended the subscription schools of the village, except during the winters of 1836-7 and 1838-9. The former period was spent in Maysville, Kentucky, attending the school of Richardson and Rand, and later in Ripley, Ohio, at a private school. I was not studious in habit, and probably did not make progress enough to compensate for the outlay for board and tuition. At all events, both winters were spent in going over the same old arithmetic, which I knew every word of before, and repeating, "A noun is the name of a thing," which I had also heard my Georgetown teachers repeat, until I had come to believe it. But I cast no reflections upon my old teacher, Richardson. He turned out bright scholars from his school, many of whom have filled conspicuous places in the service of their states. 2 of my contemporaries there, who I believe never attended any other institution of learning, have held seats in Congress and won, if not both, other high offices. These are Wadsworth and Brewster. My father was, from my earliest recollection, in comfortable circumstances, considering the times, his place of residence, and the community in which he lived. Mindful of his own lack of facilities for acquiring an education, his greatest desire in maturer years was for the education of his children. Consequently, as stated before, I never missed a quarter from school from the time I was old enough to attend till time of leaving home. This did not exempt me from labor. In my early days, everyone labored more or less in the region where my youth was spent, and more in proportion to their private means. It was only the very poor who were exempt. While my father carried on the manufacture of leather and worked at the trade himself, he owned and tilled considerable land. I detested the trade, preferring almost any other labor, but I was fond of agriculture and all employment in which horses were used. We had, among other lands, 50 acres of forest within a mile of the village. In the fall of the year, choppers were employed to cut enough wood to last a 12-month. When I was 7 or 8 years of age, I began hauling all the wood used in the house and shops. I could not load it on the wagons, of course, at the time, but I could drive, and the choppers would load, and someone at the house unload. When about 11 years old, I was strong enough to hold a plow. From that age until 17, I did all the work done with horses, such as breaking up the land, furrowing, plowing corn and potatoes, bringing in the crops when harvested, hauling all the wood, besides tending 2 or 3 horses, a cow or 2, and sawing wood for stoves, etc., while still attending school. For this I was compensated by the fact that there was never any scolding or punishing by my parents. No objections to rational enjoyments such as fishing, going to the creeks a mile away to swim in summer, taking a horse and visiting my grandparents in the adjoining county 15 miles off, skating on the ice in winter, or taking a horse and sleigh when there was snow on the ground. While still quite young, I visited Cincinnati, 45 miles away, several times alone, also Maysville, Kentucky often, and once Louisville. The journey to Louisville was a big one for a boy of that day. I had also gone once with a 2-horse carriage to Chillicothe, about 70 miles, with a neighbor's family who were removing to Toledo, Ohio, and returned alone, and had gone once, in like manner, to Flat Rock, Kentucky, about 70 miles away. On this later occasion I was 15 years of age. While at Flat Rock, at the house of a Mr. Payne, whom I was visiting with his brother, a neighbor of ours in Georgetown, I saw a very fine saddle horse, which I rather coveted, and hesitated to trade with a boy, but asking his brother about it, the latter told me that it would be all right, that I was allowed to do as I pleased with the horses. I was 70 miles from home with a carriage to take back, and Mr. Payne said he did not know that his horse had ever had a collar on. I asked to have him hitched to a farm wagon, and we would soon see whether he would work. It was soon evident that the horse had never worn harness before, but he showed no viciousness, and I expressed a confidence that I could manage him. A trade was at once struck, I receiving $10 difference. The next day Mr. Payne, of Georgetown, and I started on our return, when we encountered a ferocious dog that frightened the horses and made them run. The new animal kicked at every jump he made, and I got the horses stopped, however, before any damage was done, and without running into anything. After giving them a little rest, to quiet their fears, we started again. That instant the new horse kicked, and started to run once more. The road we were on struck the turnpike within half a mile of the point where the second runway commenced, and there was an embankment 20 or more feet deep on the opposite side of the pike. I got the horses stopped on the very brink of that precipice. My new horse was terribly frightened and trembled like an aspen, but he was not half so badly frightened as my companion, Mr. Payne, who deserted me after this last experience, and took passage on a freight wagon for Maysville. Every time I attempted to start, my new horse would commence to kick. I was in quite a dilemma for a time. Once in Maysville I could borrow a horse from an uncle who lived there, but I was more than a day's travel from that point. Finally I took out my bandana, the style of handkerchief in universal use then, and with this blindfolded my horse. In this way I reached Maysville safely the next day, no doubt much to the surprise of my friend. Here I borrowed a horse from my uncle, and the following day we proceeded on our journey. About half my school days in Georgetown were spent at the school of John D. White, a North Carolinian, and the father of Chilton White, who represented the district in Congress for one term during the rebellion. Mr. White was always a Democrat in politics, and Chilton followed his father. He had 2 older brothers, all 3 being schoolmates of mine at their father's school, who did not go the same way. The second brother died before the rebellion began. He was a Whig, and afterwards a Republican. His oldest brother was a Republican and brave soldier during the rebellion. Chilton is reported as having told of an earlier horse trade of mine. As he told the story, there was a Mr. Ralston living within a few miles of the village, who owned a colt which I very much wanted. My father had offered $20 for it, but Ralston wanted $25. I was so anxious to have a colt that after the owner left, I begged to be allowed to take him at the price demanded. My father yielded, but said $20 was all the horse was worth, and told me to offer that price. If it was not accepted, I was to offer 22.5, and if that would not get him, to give the 25. I at once mounted a horse and went for the colt. When I got to Mr. Ralston's house, I said to him, "Papa says I may offer you $20 for that colt, but if you won't take, I am to offer 22.5, and if you won't take that, to give you 25. It would not require a Connecticut man to guess the price finally agreed upon. This story is nearly true. I certainly showed very plainly that I had come for the colt and meant to have him. I could not have been over 8 years old at the time. This transaction caused me a great heartburning. The story got out among the boys of the village, and it was a long time before I heard the last of it. Boys enjoy the misery of their companions, at least village boys in that day did, and in my later life I have found that all adults are not free from this peculiarity. I kept the horse until he was 4 years old, when he went blind, and I sold him for $20. When I went to Maysville to school in 1836, at the age of 14, I recognized my colt as one of the blind horses working on the tread wheel of the ferry boat. I have described enough of my early life to give an impression of the whole. I did not like to work, but I did as much of it while young as grown men could be hired to do in these days, and attended school at that same time. I had as many privileges as any boy in the village, and probably more than most of them. I have no recollection of ever having been punished at home, either by scolding or by the rod. But at school the case was different. The rod was freely used there, and I was not exempt from its influence. I could see John D. White, the schoolteacher, now, with his long beech switch always in his hand. It was not always the same one either. Switches were brought in bundles from a beechwood near the schoolhouse, by the boys for whose benefit they were intended. Often a whole bundle would be used up in a single day. I never had any hard feelings against my teacher, either while attending the school or in later years when reflecting upon my experience. Mr. White was a kind-hearted man, and was much respected by the community in which he lived. He only followed the universal custom of the period, and that under which he had received his own education.